This video is going to try and talk through the assignment, the way that it works. So if I jump to the preview, I'm going to go through a number of examples. So this first one is one that I've done up where I've just kind of engaged with myself, but it's to give an example of the way it would work. The very first image that's put up is this image here. It has writing that goes with it, so I can look at this image, and then the writing talks about how the Metropolitan Museum in New York has made its database of historical imagery available. And so it goes through and it talks about the idea of the archival and various histories and combinations of these histories all coming through together. So we've got a number of images here. The next person has come along and they've responded to it. And what they've done is they've looked at this image here, and the thing that they've taken from it is they've looked at this image and they've looked at the cow and the calf, and they've decided to talk about, as far as history goes, the way that knowledge is passed on. And so it talks about, if I just read through this bit here, this image interprets the idea of the archival and embroidery. It looks at the way in which we sometimes archive ourselves, what we collect and carry from relatives and family. Quilts, applique, crochet, embroidery, etc. Some of the images are copied and stitch, so an embroidery, and others presented in a new form. So the vase has changed to a 70s vase that belonged to one of my grandparents, and new forms added, so my grandparents lived at a Hopi. So it's taking from that other image this idea of family or passed on knowledge, the things that we did together, and it's done it in an embroidered technique. The next person looks at this image and they respond to it with this. And their write-up says, the embroidered images are looked at, and the observation that I've made from them is that they're all natural other than the vase. So the interpretation of this is there's a single man-made object amongst natural things. And so what they've done is they've taken something that's artificial, man-made, and they've put it in a natural outdoors situation. And then they've taken a photograph, they've documented it. So this is the way that they've responded to that other image. They've looked at it and said, one artificial thing amongst the natural. The next person that responds looks at this image and they have written that they've basically, because you can ask questions of the other person, you can ask them for information, you can ask them for imagery, and what this person has done is they've used an artist called Jacob Kierkegaard as an example, and what he does is he goes around and he does outdoor recordings. He actually records volcanic activity with underground microphones. So this person has basically said, where did you take this photo? Where's the setting? They've gone to that location and they've recorded the sounds. So the hand-in for them is a sound recording, but as far as documentation goes, they have to supply an image. And so they've just taken a photograph of them processing these audio recordings. So you can see with this process that there is a variety of ways that you can respond. It's what you see within an image. It can be from the writing, it can be from the imagery, and then you kind of take that and you expand it into something different. And here's some more examples. These are old student examples. It's based off this image, and then Grace has come along and she's basically done this image, and what her text talks about is her response is, what's going to be archived from our day and age? So she's got fidget spinners, Make America Great Again, throwaway coffee cups, smartphones. So she's kind of indicating, what are we going to add into this kind of archiving of history. The next person looks at Grace's, and she supplies this image. And what Adair says is she saw that the other images looked like they were, or knew that they were taken from Instagram. So she took a whole lot of images of social media and she combined them together. So it's taking what people decide to show on social media and kind of mashing them together. So it's kind of representation of self. The next person's come along and done this image. And they have basically said, from the previous work, I've drawn themes of chaos and identity. And so my response to this piece is that I'm exploring the identity of beauty. What defines or embodies the face of beauty? And so they go through and they add in this piece of writing. Another example of the three is going off this first image. Kendra has done this image that has basically just been about memories and old photos. But the next person, Ting Ting, has come along and done Marilyn Manson. And so she has looked at this image and thought that it looks like some kind of Japanese horror movie. It looks a little bit demonic. And so she writes this up. From the original image, the eyes contract points of light at times, coming back from the camera flash, hitting the back of her eye. The effect of red eyes in a photo gives an unnatural, almost demonic look. So she's been poetic with her writing here, and then it goes into Marilyn Manson would have been present at this time. And she goes through, and what she ends up doing is she starts to talk about, I felt melancholy, pain, death, and blood forming from this world. This strongly expresses negative emotions. She goes through. And then the next person responds to this. And this is really interesting because the title of this is Be Positive. And what he's done, this was a performance piece. He did a little video, and he pricked his finger and he drew with blood this smiley face. This was a man called Murray. And his reaction to the photo is he didn't like anything in it. He said, the picture of Marilyn Manson did nothing for me. I accept that he is an intelligent and articulate artist, but the person in the image did not trigger any kind of creative response. So he really had difficulty in this. And then he said what he latched onto was a sentence, and it was the one about melancholy, pain, death, and blood. And then and the one about negative emotions. And then he goes into qualities of blood, that blood is thicker than water, that blood is life-giving. And he talks about the positive aspect of blood until he gets through to this final write-up about be positive. So it really is, even when he saw nothing in the work, he was able to turn it into something that he could develop. A few more. So this image here, Healing Water, it focuses on meditative poses and this kind of brushstroke image. The next person comes along, and their meditative process is they used to make pom-poms. And so they make this pom-pom and they film it, it's documented, and it's the kind of therapeutic aspect. Next person comes along, and what they look at is not the therapeutic aspect, but they look at the color, and that's what they focus on. And it's a Chinese student who talks about the color yellow as the associations in China with the derogatory term of yellow people, but he talks about it's a noble color. It's a color of royalty and significance, a color of purity. So again, it's latching onto something within the previous image and expanding on it. this one here, looking at that original image, he was overwhelmed by the idea of tradition and the values that come with it. So Eason talks about that. The next image, the response is they looked at this image and saw that it kind of looked like an aerial photo looking down on the earth, one man kind of floating above it. And so theirs kind of develops into this kind of outer space image, the lonely man floating above the earth tradition. But where does that tradition push us into the future? Where do we go? The next person looks at all of that, and the only thing they write is people. And so through this image, and they would have a little write up on that Trello board as a workbook, but they look at that other image, and it's about these traditions, these cultures, and space all kind of combined, but it's always about people. And so they do this kind of horoscope and mapping out of the stars, a very kind of human thing to do, to look for patterns and signs and symbols. And that brings us to the end of that one. One more here, kind of going through, there's a lot more images, but you can kind of see the sequence that goes on. So this was a more recent one. This was a couple of years ago, I think. So the first image was a fan that had a whole lot of buildings from around the world. It was actually what they were doing for a major project. So they talk about this combining of the West with the East. So buildings from the West and the East, but done on this kind of traditional fan. The next person looks at this and they see the aspect of the global village, all those different buildings creating one global village, and that's the discussion that they have. The next person looks at this image and what they see is culture. And when they relate it back to themselves, they're talking about self-identity. They're talking about culture specifically to them. So the combination of the British, the French, the Māori worlds all kind of coming together, and what that kind of culture means for them. Another one here talks about the golden mean, Fibonacci numbers, all these kind of mathematical equations that give this idea of purity. The next person responds to this by going against the rules, by breaking them and saying the image that they've placed in there is beautiful, but it doesn't at all conform to these standards of beauty with the golden mean and the Vitruvian man and various things. The next person looks at this and creates this image. And what they're talking about is this idea of organized chaos, rules that keep things in order, but in art, there's rules that are broken. So it's trying to combine this idea of rules and structure and a fracturedness at the same time. The next one starts with this image that's all about COVID and isolation. How did isolation affect you? How did it make you feel? The next person looks at this, and their response is the way that New Zealand and America, how they dealt with the COVID outbreak. And so America, they've kind of put behind these bars and the structure, talking about how they felt that New Zealand dealt with it in a far more sophisticated way. The next person then reacts to this image, and they talk about the splendidness of isolation, that actually when they were isolated, for them, they had a great time. They got more work done, they spent more time with family, and that actually for them they felt it was a positive experience. This was a really unique one, where it's a kind of kaleidoscope of of Taylor, who was a smoker. So it's him having a cigarette, and he's made this chaotic, turbulent image from him having a cigarette. And his writing is far more poetic. So he talks about 7:30 a.m. wake up, out of the house at 8 a.m., in town at 8:15 or 8:20, depending on traffic. So what he's doing with the writing is he's trying to replicate this idea of desperately needing a cigarette, this addictive quality in both image and in the text in the write-up. And he would explain this on the Trello board in a kind of workbook page, but it allows him to be more poetic with his writing. The next person had a really beautiful response where they were a jewelry student, and they used alchemy a lot in their jewelry. That was the kind of focus for their major project. And what they did is they took this image, I think they might have taken the center and doctored it up, and they burnt it and created these ashes that they put in a jar. And it was this kind of alchemaic reaction. And they just wrote, this habit has turned to ash, and his power is now returned to him. And what they tried to talk about in their workbook is that by burning his image in this kind of ritualistic way, that in a way they were trying to help cure him of his habits. And they talked about the use of smoke in ceremonies by Native American Indians or First Nation people, and these kind of ceremonial responses. So again, a beautiful piece, a performative piece, and in the end what they handed in was a piece of basically a documentative photo. Okay, so we can kind of see the pattern that goes through all these exercises. The first image and piece of writing goes up, and it doesn't matter what it is, and then we can kind of pick another piece of work and we respond to it, and we can look at that work in any way we want. We can select something from the text, we can select the overall idea, we can ask the person if it's a Photoshop document for the files, and we can remix and re-edit and cut and paste their images and turn it into something else. We can focus on just the color. We can focus on the concept that sits behind it. It's about you observing or seeing something in a piece of work, and then how you can kind of extrapolate that out into something new and creative.